Watch. A road 724 kilometers long, lonely forests, scattered settlements, hitchhiking as the only way to reach the next town. For more than 50 years, girls have disappeared here. Almost always young, almost always indigenous, almost always without a trace. And all of it along one highway, the same one again and again. Police said she left willingly. The media stayed quiet, but too much repeats. The age, the route, the circumstances, the indifference. What turns an ordinary road into a place people fear to walk even by day? Why have dozens of victims never been found? And who exploited this corridor to hunt without consequence? This isn't a legend. This is the Highway of Tears. And the farther one drives, the more terrifying it becomes to realize how real it is. Look at a map of British Columbia. Highway 16 is a thin red line across the endless green of the Canadian North. This 724-kilometer route links Prince George in the east to the port of Prince Rupert on the Pacific coast. For most Canadians, it is just a transport artery, the only overland path through the province's northern spine. But for Indigenous families, for advocates, and for investigators, it bears another darker name, the Highway of Tears. Over the last 50 years, along this road, more than several dozen women and girls have vanished or been found murdered. Most were from Indigenous communities. Many were teenagers. Nearly all were traveling by hitchhiking. To understand why this highway became a place of tragedy, picture northern British Columbia. Vast forests, mountain ranges, and small communities separated by hundreds of kilometers of wilderness. Between the larger towns, Prince George, Smithers, Terrace, and Prince Rupert, are smaller settlements and First Nations reserves. Distances can stretch from 50 to 200 kilometers. Public transportation is scarce. Buses are infrequent, expensive, and poorly timed. For many residents, especially low-income Indigenous women, hitchhiking is not a choice. It is a necessity. The climate is unforgiving. Winters run 7 to 8 months, with temperatures dropping to -40. In summer, thick forests hem the road, places where a person can vanish and evidence can be hidden. But geography is only part of the story. The region's social structure creates vulnerability. Northern British Columbia is home to many Indigenous nations: Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en, Dakel, Carrier, Tagish, and others. Many reserves face high unemployment, poverty, and systemic social challenges. Young women often must leave home for school, medical care, or work, headed to Prince George, Vancouver, Calgary. The main path runs along Highway 16. Without money for a bus or plane, they stand by the shoulder with cardboard signs. Vancouver, Prince George, Smithers. The Highway of Tears did not begin yesterday. The first documented disappearances date back to the early 1970s, though locals say women were going missing there even earlier. For a long time, no one recognized a pattern. Each case was treated in isolation. A missing girl, maybe she ran away. A body, an accident, or a domestic crime. Police did not compare cases, did not track common features, did not analyze the statistics. Families felt abandoned. Many believed authorities were indifferent to the fate of Indigenous women. Only in the 1990s, when the number of disappearances reached a critical mass, did the public begin to speak of a series. The name took hold, the Highway of Tears. An analysis of the cases reveals a bleak pattern. The typical victim along the Highway of Tears is a woman between 15 and 25, Indigenous, from a low-income family, hitchhiking, because there is no money for other transport. She might be a student headed to classes in town, a young mother taking a child to a hospital, or a teenager traveling to look for work. What unites them is vulnerability, isolated on an empty road, dependent on the goodwill of strangers, without means of protection. For years, the disappearances along Highway 16 were met with silence. Media attention was scarce. Police did not recognize a systemic problem. The public showed little interest. That silence had a racial dimension. When a white woman from the middle class goes missing, headlines erupt, police mobilize, the public demands answers. When poor Indigenous girls vanish, the response is far weaker. Families spoke openly about this disparity, saying they felt the racism and class prejudice in how their daughters' cases were treated. Highway 16 crosses varied terrain. The eastern stretch, Prince George to Smithers, is relatively populated with several small towns, yet even here there are segments 50 to 70 kilometers without a settlement. The central stretch, Smithers to Terrace, is more isolated, threading mountain passes and dense forests, with gaps up to 100 kilometers between communities. The western stretch, Terrace to Prince Rupert, is the most dangerous, roughly 160 kilometers with almost no towns through thick coastal rainforests. It is on these empty segments that most disappearances occurred. A young woman gets into a vehicle and the trail dissolves into the endless woods of northern Canada. The dates show seasonal patterns. Disappearances peak in late spring and summer, from May through September. In warm months, more people hitchhike. Winter's severe weather deters travel. Summer is also when young people move, attend school, search for work, or visit relatives. Forest canopies hide evidence more easily in warmer seasons. Winter snow preserves tracks that might otherwise vanish. The highway traverses an economically depressed region. Mill closures, mine shutdowns, and industry loss left many towns without work. Young people, especially from Indigenous communities, must look elsewhere for opportunity, but moving costs money they do not have. Hitchhiking becomes the only option. Economic decline also fuels risk factors: unemployment, alcohol and drug abuse, domestic violence, an environment where predators can operate. The road itself compounds danger. Many stretches are one lane in each direction, without a median. Hitchhikers stand close to traffic on narrow shoulders lined by thick trees. There is often nowhere to run if a ride turns threatening. Cell service is patchy. Long sections have no signal. Services, fuel, diners, motels, can be 100 to 150 kilometers apart. Cultural context matters. For generations, Northern First Nations traveled widely across ancestral land for hunting, fishing, and gathering. Reserves restricted that mobility, but the tradition of moving long distances endured. Young people are not afraid of the road. It is part of life. Many cultures in the region also prize hospitality and trust, making young women more exposed to predatory behavior when they must rely on strangers. Officially, one of the earliest recognized victims is Gloria Moody, an 18-year-old from the Dakhel Carrier Nation who disappeared in 1970 while traveling from her reserve toward Smithers. Locals say the tragedies began even earlier. The difference is that in the past, disappearances of Indigenous women were not publicized, not thoroughly investigated, and not entered into official statistics. Our grandmothers told stories of girls who vanished on the old trails even before the highway was built, recalls Matrin Gusta, an activist from the Wet'suwet'en Nation. But no one wrote those stories down. Today, Highway 16 remains the main artery of northern British Columbia. Thousands of vehicles pass daily: cars, trucks, buses. Some sections have been widened, lighting improved, cameras added. Yet most of the route remains as isolated and dangerous as it was 50 years ago. And Indigenous women still hitchhike. The economic realities have not changed. Public transport is still out of reach for many. The social crises in reserves are unresolved. Over decades, Highway 16 has become a symbol of broader Canadian problems: racism toward Indigenous peoples, government indifference to marginalized communities, gender-based violence, and economic inequality. Activists use Highway of Tears as a metaphor for the condition of Indigenous women across the country. It is not just a road where crimes happen, it is a symbol of systemic discrimination. More than 50 years after the first documented disappearances, Highway 16 remains dangerous for young women. Through the 2000s and beyond, people continued to vanish, bodies were still found, and families kept grieving. The road across northern emptiness still claims those forced to rely on the kindness of strangers. The Highway of Tears is not merely a geographic place, it is a social phenomenon born at the intersection of racism, poverty, isolation, and neglect. Until those forces change, the road will remain perilous for the most vulnerable. June 18, 1970. 18-year-old Gloria Morin stood on the shoulder of Highway 16 near the St. James Reserve, trying to thumb a ride to Smithers to visit relatives. Gloria was carrier, docile, finishing high school, dreaming of college. She was smart, responsible, never a source of trouble. She had no reason to run away. Drivers saw her around 2 in the afternoon, red blouse, jeans, a small backpack. She smiled and waved at passing cars. After 3, no one saw her again. She vanished without a trace along a 90-kilometer stretch between Fort St. James and Smithers. When she failed to arrive by evening, her relatives became alarmed. They knew her well. If plans changed, she would call. The next day, the family contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The duty constable reacted without urgency. "Teenagers change plans," he said. Maybe she went elsewhere, maybe stayed with friends. Only after 3 days did police launch a formal search. By then, precious time was gone. Tracks along the road were erased. Possible witnesses had moved on. For a week, officers and volunteers combed the forests, checked abandoned buildings, and interviewed truckers. They found nothing. She disappeared as cleanly as hundreds who would vanish along this road in the decades to come. The police response to Gloria Morin's case became typical for that era. Constables did not treat the disappearance of an Indigenous girl with seriousness. Stereotypes ruled the file. Indigenous women drift. Their lives are unstable. They leave willingly. Mostly white male officers had little understanding of Indigenous communities and culture. Gloria's family felt that bias. "They searched for our daughter at half strength," her mother, Rose Morin, later said. If a white girl from a wealthy family had vanished, the search would have been very different. The case was closed a month later as a disappearance under unknown circumstances. A criminal act was not seriously pursued. To understand why Indigenous women became the primary victims of the Highway of Tears, the history with the Canadian state must be faced. For generations, policy aimed at assimilation sought to erase Indigenous cultures. Children were taken from families and placed in residential schools, where they were forbidden to speak their languages or follow their traditions. The creation of reserves restricted traditional Indigenous territories. Many communities lost access to hunting grounds, fishing sites, and sacred places. The economic base of life was shattered, and that historical trauma still shapes Indigenous communities today. High levels of poverty, unemployment, alcoholism, and domestic violence are all legacies of colonial policy. Indigenous women were made especially vulnerable, facing a double burden of discrimination, both as Indigenous and as women. The statistics speak plainly. Violence against Indigenous women is estimated at roughly 3 times the rate faced by other Canadian women. Indigenous women are about 6 times more likely to be victims of homicide. Average income for Indigenous women is roughly 30% lower. Educational attainment and access to health care are significantly lower. These factors made young Indigenous women easier targets for predators. Stereotypes and prejudice mattered. In the 1970s and 80s, harmful myths about Indigenous women were widespread, depicting them as promiscuous, involved in sex work, or living on the margins. These were not grounded in reality, but they shaped how police, media, and the public responded. When an Indigenous woman disappeared or was found dead, the first question too often was she a sex worker? The victim was implicitly blamed. This bias produced shallow investigations. Fewer resources, less urgency, fewer leads pursued, because the case was judged less important. Many reserves in northern British Columbia were isolated and lacked adequate public transit. Hospitals, schools, and stores could be dozens or even hundreds of kilometers away. For low-income families, a bus ticket, say, from Prince George to Vancouver at more than $100 was out of reach. Hitchhiking was not a choice. It was a necessity. Young women hitchhiked for medical care, schooling, and work. Traditional values of hospitality and mutual aid also shaped behavior. Travelers were helped, strangers were fed and sheltered. Those values could translate into trust toward unknown drivers. Many young women from reserves also had limited experience with urban risks and did not know how to read danger cues on the road. They did not always sense a threat where a more streetwise person might. Relations between Indigenous communities and law enforcement were thin. Most reserves did not have a constant police presence. RCMP officers often arrived only for major incidents. That fostered an atmosphere of impunity. Offenders knew that in remote areas with Indigenous populations, they could act without fearing a rapid police response. Young Indigenous women found themselves unprotected, neither by family once they left home, nor by the state when authorities were indifferent. Even when cases were opened, disappearances of Indigenous women often received fewer resources than comparable cases involving white victims. Studies have shown such files were closed faster with less time and attention. Media coverage was lighter. Families received less support and information. The discrimination was often unexamined rather than explicit, but the outcome was the same. The lives of Indigenous women were valued less. Many Indigenous women who survived assaults or attempted abductions along Highway 16 never reported them. They did not trust the authorities. They feared blame or simply did not believe their cases would be taken seriously. That silence hid the true scale of the crisis. Official statistics captured only the tip of the iceberg, cases too visible to ignore. By the late 1970s, some Indigenous leaders began speaking publicly about the disappearances along Highway 16. Wet'suwet'en Chief Warner William Adamus: I stated that police were not taking Indigenous women's safety seriously and called for stronger highway patrols and deeper investigations. But Indigenous leaders lacked political weight. Warnings were ignored by officials and media. It took years and dozens more victims before the Highway of Tears forced its way into public consciousness. The 1990s became the bloodiest decade in the highway's history. More women disappeared or were killed than in any other period. Only then did public attention and media finally turn toward the pattern. By the early 1990s, more than a dozen victims were already linked to the corridor. Yet authorities still tended to treat each case in isolation, unable or unwilling to see the larger picture emerging along the road. The reserve system confined Indigenous nations to limited lands. Many lost access to hunting grounds, fisheries, and sacred sites. The economic foundation of life was broken, and that historical trauma still echoes today. Poverty, unemployment, alcoholism, and domestic violence remain legacies of colonial policy. Indigenous women were placed in an especially vulnerable position, carrying a double burden of discrimination, as Indigenous and as women. The numbers are stark. Violence against Indigenous women is roughly 3 times higher than against other Canadian women. They are about 6 times more likely to be homicide victims. Average income is roughly 30% lower. Educational attainment and healthcare access are significantly lower. These factors combined to make young Indigenous women easy targets for predators. Stereotypes and prejudice did damage. In the 1970s and 80s, deeply rooted myths depicted Indigenous women as promiscuous, involved in sex work, or leading chaotic lives. These falsehoods shaped police, media, and public responses. When an Indigenous woman disappeared or was found dead, the first question too often was whether she was a sex worker, blame aimed at the victim. Investigations suffered, less effort, fewer resources, fewer leads pursued. Many northern reserves were isolated with little or no public transit. Hospitals, schools, and shops could be dozens or hundreds of kilometers away. For low-income families, a bus ticket from Prince George to Vancouver, well over $100, was unaffordable. Hitchhiking was not a choice, it was a necessity. Young women hitched to reach medical care, schooling, or work. Traditional values of hospitality and mutual aid meant travelers were helped, strangers fed. Those values could foster trust in unknown drivers. Many young women from reserves had limited exposure to urban risks and did not recognize danger cues on the road. They did not always sense threat where a more streetwise person might. Ties between Indigenous communities and law enforcement were thin. Most reserves lacked a constant police presence. Officers often came only for major incidents. That fostered impunity. Offenders knew remote Indigenous areas would not see a swift response. Young Indigenous women were unprotected by family once they left home, and by the state when authorities were indifferent. Even when cases were opened, disappearances of Indigenous women often received fewer resources than comparable cases involving white victims. Such files closed faster with less time and attention. Media coverage was lighter. Families received less support and information. This discrimination was often unexamined rather than explicit, but the effect was the same. The lives of Indigenous women were valued less. Many Indigenous women who survived assaults or attempted abductions along Highway 16 never reported them. They did not trust the authorities, feared blame, or doubted their cases would be taken seriously. The silence masked the true scale of the crisis. Official statistics captured only the most undeniable cases. By the late 1970s, some Indigenous leaders spoke out about the disappearances along Highway 16. Wet'suwet'en Chief Warner William Adamus, I argued police were not protecting Indigenous women, calling for stronger patrols and deeper investigations. But Indigenous leadership lacked political clout. Officials and media looked away. It took years and dozens more victims before the crisis gained public recognition. Everything changed when the vanishings became brutally regular. Through the 1990s, roughly every 8 months another woman disappeared along Highway 16. Most were never found. Those recovered were dead. June 27, 1994. 14-year-old Roxy Thomas left the Cheslata Reserve to visit friends in a neighboring community. Outgoing and bright, she dreamed of becoming a teacher. She planned to hitch 30 kilometers to Vanderhoof, a routine trip for teens between settlements. The last sighting was around 3 in the afternoon at the roadside near the reserve. Blue t-shirt, black jeans, a smile, and a wave. When she did not return by evening, her family knew the route and knew something was wrong. Roxy's disappearance became a turning point. For the first time, Indigenous communities organized a large-scale search, independent of police. More than 200 volunteers from multiple reserves swept the forests, checked abandoned buildings, and questioned drivers. Searches ran for 2 weeks, with round-the-clock shifts and flyers handed out along the highway. Roxy's body was found 8 kilometers into the woods. She had been murdered. Her killer was never identified. Local media took notice. For the first time, journalists compiled statistics for Highway 16. A major segment titled "The Road of Disappearances" analyzed roughly 15 cases across 2 decades. Young Indigenous women hitchhiking lonely stretches between small towns. It was the first time the press framed the disappearances as a series, not isolated incidents. September 4, 1994. 19-year-old Alicia Germain left the Fort St. James Reserve for Prince George to start university. A top student with a scholarship to study education, she dreamed of returning to teach in her community. With no money for a bus ticket, she planned to hitch the 150 kilometers, long but common for youth from the reserves. She was last seen at a gas station in Vanderhoof, buying water and asking directions to Prince George. The attendant remembered her. She talked about her plans for school. After that, her trail vanished. When the family reported her missing, the initial response was indifferent. Suggestions she had changed her mind about school or met someone. Official searches began only after 5 days. By then, witnesses had scattered and leads had gone cold. The operation lasted just 3 days. Alicia was never found. Her case was closed within a month. June 11, 1994. 16-year-old Ramona Wilson set off from Smithers toward Terrace to visit an aunt for the summer. Quiet, bookish, she dreamed of nursing. The bus ran only twice a week. She could not wait, so she tried to hitch a ride from the stop in Smithers. Her remains were discovered a year later in woods near the highway. The coroner concluded she was killed shortly after she vanished. January 27, 1996. 23-year-old Delilah Paul left her reserve for Prince George to secure social assistance for her 2 small children. A single mother doing everything to keep the family afloat, she promised to return that same day and left the children with her mother. Witnesses saw her climb into a truck on the reserve's edge with an unfamiliar middle-aged man. She never came back. After 3 days waiting, the family went to police. Searches yielded nothing. Delilah disappeared, leaving 2 children without a parent. By the mid-1990s, the pattern could not be ignored. Too many women, the same corridor, the same circumstances. Indigenous activists began keeping their own records, lists of victims, disappearance sites mapped, common traits identified. The profile was stark. Victims between 14 and 25, roughly 90% Indigenous, all hitchhiking, vanishing along specific stretches, most in warm months. Profilers suggested a serial predator operating along Highway 16, someone who knew the terrain and traffic rhythms, had a car or truck, understood Indigenous communities, and exploited weak investigations. Possibilities included a long-haul trucker familiar with the route or a local resident using the region's isolation to offend undetected. Activist Gleedy Reddick, who lost a niece to the Highway of Tears, began compiling an unofficial database of disappearances and murders. Police reports, news clippings, and family accounts, building case files with ages, sites, circumstances, and investigative outcomes. By the late 1990s, her list held roughly 30 cases. Most were unresolved. Identified perpetrators existed in only a handful. With facts accumulating and communities mobilizing, pressure mounted on provincial authorities. For the first time, officials had to answer publicly about safety on Highway 16. In 1997, the Premier of British Columbia, Glenn Clark, acknowledged the problem and promised enhanced patrols. But no concrete, sustained measures followed, no surge in officers, no dedicated task forces, no major resource increases. Despite rising attention, the disappearances continued. The 1990s ended with more tragedy. In 1998, 19-year-old Lana Derrick vanished. In 1999, 18-year-old Nika Hall disappeared. Both were young Indigenous women hitchhiking along Highway 16. Neither was ever found. By the turn of the millennium, more than 20 victims were officially linked to the Highway of Tears, while activists warned the true number was far higher. Many disappearances had never been properly documented or investigated. The decade proved the crisis would not resolve itself. It was getting worse. Government inaction, police indifference, and the steady drumbeat of disappearances created a volatile situation. Indigenous communities were losing patience. Families demanded justice. Activists prepared for more direct action. The new millennium would bring fresh tragedies, but also a new resolve to force change. The epidemic of the 1990s compelled Canadian society to admit that something horrific was happening along Highway 16 and that immediate intervention was required. Law enforcement along the corridor fell primarily to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in rural British Columbia. A review of investigations revealed structural problems. The RCMP's historical role, imposing control over Indigenous peoples and policing remote frontiers, left a cultural divide with communities that persists. Through the 1970s to 1990s, most officers posted in the North were white men from other provinces, unfamiliar with local languages and cultures, and too often shaped by stereotypes. Northern British Columbia spans more than 300,000 square kilometers with few detachments. A single constable could be responsible for an area the size of a small European country. Stations were clustered in larger towns, Prince George, Smithers, Terrace, Prince Rupert, leaving hundreds of kilometers without a constant police presence. When a disappearance occurred, the nearest officer might be 2 or 3 hours away. By the time police arrived, tracks were gone. There were also gaps in expertise. Local officers were trained for domestic disputes and minor offenses, not complex serial crime investigations. Each disappearance on Highway 16 was handled by whichever detachment had local jurisdiction, and those detachments shared little information. Patterns went unnoticed. A constable in Smithers might not know a near-identical case occurred in Terrace a month earlier. There was no centralized database. Records were kept locally, often incomplete and disorganized. Attempts to coordinate began only in the late 1990s, after crucial opportunities had been lost. Police reports from the period show bias. Files frequently assumed Indigenous women had left voluntarily or were living risky lifestyles. Phrases recurred. Subject known to drift. Likely went to acquaintances in another reserve. Possible alcohol involvement, lifestyle instability. Such framing led to shallow investigations, less time, fewer resources, faster closures compared to cases involving white victims. Families consistently reported poor treatment by officers. Families were rarely kept informed. Calls went unanswered. Tips and leads from relatives were brushed aside. Many felt police saw their daughters, sisters, and mothers as unworthy of a serious investigation. The result was deeper distrust. Loved ones organized their own searches because they did not believe official efforts would help. In the 1970s and 80s, police lacked modern tools. There were no integrated computer databases to link similar crimes. Communication between far-flung detachments was limited. Forensics were constrained. DNA testing only became available in the late 1980s. Aerial and satellite reconnaissance were not used in ground searches. These technical limits made work harder, but they did not explain the apathy. Inside the force, a culture discouraged self-critique. Officers avoided admitting mistakes or questioning colleagues. When a missing person case closed without results, it was treated as routine, rather than as a reason to rethink methods. Criticism from Indigenous communities was dismissed as emotional or unfounded. There was no perceived need to change. There were no specialized units for missing persons or serial crime investigations. General duty constables were expected to handle everything. But disappearances demand specific skills: working with families, analyzing crime patterns, coordinating searches. Those skills were not part of standard training. Investigations suffered, leads were missed, theories went untested. Informal pressure pushed officers to close files quickly. Lingering cases hurt detachment statistics. It was easier to mark a file "disappearance under unknown circumstances" than to spend months on searches with no guaranteed success. Many files closed early, long before all investigative options were exhausted. One case tells the story with painful clarity. Tamara Chipman, 22, vanished in September 1987, traveling from Prince Rupert toward Terrace. The family reported her missing a day after she failed to arrive. A constable took the report, but no immediate action followed. Searches began only 4 days later. Rain had already washed away traces. Several truckers reported seeing a woman matching Tamara's description, but statements were not recorded in full. The investigation lasted 2 weeks. Family interviewed, a few roadside stretches checked, and the file was closed as likely voluntary. 3 years later, hunters found her body 40 kilometers from the highway. There were signs of homicide. By then, most evidence was gone. Jurisdictional lines along the highway were messy. Multiple detachments and municipal police services overlapped. When remains were found near a boundary, departments argued over who should lead. Time was lost to bureaucracy. In some instances, files were handed back and forth, each transfer forcing investigators to start over. Most officers had no training for working with Indigenous communities. Cultural differences were misread. History between police and First Nations was poorly understood. Families felt disrespected, mistrust deepened. Cultural norms, reserved affect, indirect speech, communal decision-making were too often read as suspicious or unstable lifestyle, feeding bias in reports. When searches did occur, they were often small and poorly planned, a few kilometers of shoulder checked with little effort to push into the woods. Deep forest sweeps were rare. Indigenous volunteers knew the land better than anyone, yet their help was sometimes accepted grudgingly, or not at all. Search dogs were not consistently deployed and often too late for scent work to matter. The gravest failure was the inability to see the connections. Each disappearance was boxed in as a one-off, without pattern analysis or linkage. The road told a story in pieces. No one in authority assembled them. Indigenous activists tried to draw police attention to the similarities between cases, but their warnings were ignored. Police did not analyze the data, did not look for common features, and did not attempt to build a profile of a potential offender. Only in the late 1990s, when the number of victims could no longer be ignored, did authorities begin to consider the disappearances as a connected series. Police communications with the media were poor. Investigators rarely sought journalists' help to find witnesses or circulate missing person information. When the press pursued the stories, officials were reluctant to share details, citing the integrity of investigations. The result, the public remained in the dark about the true scale of the problem, and warnings about hitchhiking risks did not spread effectively. Despite access to federal resources for major crimes, those assets were seldom used for missing Indigenous women. Serial crime units, profilers, behavioral analysts, available but not deployed on Highway 16. National crime databases were underused for cross-provincial link analysis. Prevention lagged too. No sustained awareness programs on hitchhiking dangers. No regular patrols on high-risk segments. Little collaboration with Indigenous communities to create alternatives to hitchhiking or safer travel conditions. Response dominated over prevention. Paradoxically, some inquiries suffered from an anxiety about appearing prejudiced. Officers avoided direct questions about risk behaviors, fearing the label of racism. That hesitation led to incomplete fact-gathering and missed details that might have moved cases forward. By the late 1990s, public pressure forced reform. New protocols for missing person investigations appeared, specialized teams were formed, and coordination improved. In 2001, an integrated investigative group for Highway 16 brought several detachments' resources together. But the measures came too late. Decades of ineffective work had allowed offenders to act with impunity and cost dozens of women their lives. In 2010, senior leadership officially acknowledged serious shortcomings in the Highway 16 investigations. The commissioner issued a public apology to families and promised fundamental changes. Systemic problems, racism, resource gaps, poor coordination were recognized as contributors to the Highway of Tears tragedy. The apology mattered, but it could not restore lives or heal families. These failures became case studies in police academies worldwide, showing how systemic bias and structural gaps produce catastrophic outcomes. Core lessons followed: specialized training for working with vulnerable groups, rapid response to disappearances, robust inter-unit coordination, rigorous pattern analysis, and true partnerships with local communities. The lessons shaped reforms not only within the national force, but across other agencies in Canada and abroad. The Highway of Tears measured police failure not in clearance rates, but in human lives. Dozens might still be alive if authorities had acted more effectively and fairly. By the mid-1990s, families knew they could not rely solely on police. They built one of the most influential Indigenous rights movements in modern Canadian history. The catalyst was Gladys Raddick, aunt of the missing Tamara Chipman. After her niece's case was closed without results, Gladys began to look for answers herself, gathering information on other disappearances, contacting families, documenting each case. A circle formed around her, women who had lost daughters, sisters, nieces along Highway 16. In 1996, the first gathering of families took place at a community center in Terrace. 12 women came. Each had lost someone. They sat in a circle and shared their stories. Many cried. For the first time, they could speak openly about their grief with people who truly understood. Matilda Wilson, who lost her daughter Ramona, remembered, "I thought grief would drive me mad. But when I heard other mothers' stories, I realized we were not alone. And if their suffering could prevent new tragedies, it would not be in vain." At that gathering, families resolved to form a formal organization to seek justice and prevent further disappearances. In 1997, Families of the Missing was officially registered. Gladys Raddick became chair. The goals were clear: secure fair investigations for every disappearance, support the victims' families, raise public awareness, lobby for changes in policing, and prevent new tragedies. They began by building a memorial website with photos and stories of every victim, the first time cases were collected in one place. Each October, they held a candlelight memorial on the banks of the Skeena River near Terrace, reading the names of the missing. The ceremonies drew media and public attention. Reporters saw the human faces of the crisis: mothers without daughters, children growing up without parents. Gradually, non-Indigenous supporters joined. The Highway of Tears ceased to be seen as only an Indigenous problem. Families took their case to every level of government. Delegations met with mayors, members of the provincial legislature, and federal MPs. The demands were concrete: more officers on Highway 16, a dedicated investigative unit for disappearances, bus service linking reserves, emergency phones along the route, and an independent review of police failures. Gladys Raddick proved a formidable media strategist. She knew attention requires both facts and feeling. Families invited journalists to the disappearance sites, showed the empty roadway, and told the stories of specific victims. Interviews with mothers were especially powerful. When Florence Naziel spoke live about her missing daughter, few viewers could remain unmoved. By the late 1990s, the story crossed Canada's borders. Human rights groups cited the crisis in annual reports. International scrutiny grew, and pressure mounted on Ottawa to act. Canada did not want to be seen as a country where human rights were systematically denied. Knowing reform takes time, families turned to prevention, especially with youth. New awareness programs taught hitchhiking risks. Workshops in reserve schools covered travel safety, not to frighten girls, but to make dangers real. We don't want our children to live in fear, organizers said, but they must know the truth about this road. They built a support network for families facing a disappearance. Veteran advocates guided new families through police procedures, offered legal referrals, organized volunteer searches, and provided emotional care, filling gaps left by the state's victim services system. Documentation became central. They gathered not only the bare facts, but the lives behind them. Who these women were, what they dreamed of, how loved ones remember them. Detailed case files, photos, family testimonies, timelines became tools for both media work and law enforcement briefings. There was pushback. Some officers said activists hindered investigations. Some politicians called them radicals, inflaming the issue. Smear attempts surfaced. Gladys Radek received anonymous threats. But families did not retreat. They understood the fight was not only for justice for their loved ones, it was for the safety of generations to come. By the late 1990s, the family's persistence began to yield results. In 1998, British Columbia's government allocated additional funding for patrols along Highway 16. A subsidized bus program linking reserves was launched, limited in coverage, but a first step toward an alternative to hitchhiking. Police response times improved, and investigations grew more thorough. As the organization grew, strategic differences emerged. Some leaders focused on working within the system for gradual reforms. Others pushed for direct action, highway blockades, protests at government offices, international campaigns. A split followed. A more radical group, Highway of Tears Action, embraced civil resistance tactics. By the 2000s, a new generation joined, the children and younger relatives of the missing, raised in the shadow of the Highway of Tears. They brought new tools, social media, flash mob organizing, and documentary filmmaking. Technically savvy and globally connected, they broadened the movement's reach. The Families Movement reshaped Indigenous communities nationwide. It showed that organized pressure can deliver change. Similar groups emerged in other provinces facing violence against Indigenous women. Methods refined on Highway 16 spread across Canada. Cross-border ties formed with Indigenous advocates in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, proof that violence against Indigenous women is a global crisis, not a single country's shame. By the end of the 1990s, Canadian public consciousness had shifted. Violence against Indigenous women was no longer taboo. Foundations were laid for sweeping reforms, a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, police overhauls, and specialized laws. Families turned grief into leverage for change. "We could not save our daughters," said Gladys Radek, "but we can make sure their deaths were not in vain. We can protect the next generation." The struggle continues. Families of the Highway of Tears became a symbol of resistance to injustice and a fight for the dignity of Canada's Indigenous peoples. February 2002. Police arrested Robert William Picton, a pig farmer from suburban Vancouver. A search of his Port Coquitlam property uncovered remains linked to at least 24 women, many of them Indigenous, and from Vancouver's downtown east side. Though his farm lay roughly 200 kilometers south of Highway 16, there were troubling overlaps. Several women tied to the corridor were last seen in Vancouver, where they could have been lured. Picton preyed on society's most vulnerable, Indigenous women, sex workers, women struggling with addiction or homelessness, knowing their disappearances rarely triggered urgent, sustained investigations. On his farm, he hosted raucous parties frequented by bikers and criminal elements, inviting women from the downtown east side with promises of cash, drugs, and a ride. Many Indigenous women had come south from northern reserves, often traveling by hitchhiking along Highway 16. Some accepted a ride to the farm and were never seen again. Investigators would ultimately tie Pickton to numerous disappearances, and in 2007 he was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no parole eligibility for 25 years. The remaining murder charges, more than 20, were stayed, as he was already serving the maximum sentence. Pickton died in prison in 2024 after an assault by another inmate. The case ignited public fury and forced a reckoning with the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, echoing the warnings raised for years along Highway 16. Families had long said the pattern was visible. Authorities, at last, had to see it too. Along Highway 16, Tenya Holick vanished in October 1996, traveling from Prince Rupert toward Vancouver. Her personal effects were later found on Robert Pickton's farm. Diana Mayers disappeared in December 1995 after catching a ride near Smithers. Witnesses placed her in Vancouver days before she went missing. Andy Crowford vanished in November 1993 en route to Vancouver. Her remains were recovered on Pickton's property. These cases suggested Highway 16 was not only a crime scene, but also a conduit, moving victims toward serial predators operating near the coast. The Pickton case exposed the same policing failures seen along the Highway of Tears. For years, Vancouver authorities dismissed disappearances from the downtown east side. The first missing person report surfaced in the mid-1980s. By the late 1990s, more than 60 women had vanished from the same neighborhood, yet the pattern went officially unrecognized. Families repeatedly flagged Pickton's farm as a likely site, but thorough searches did not occur until 2002. Another serial predator linked to the corridor was Corey Fogan, a long-haul driver who regularly ran northern British Columbia routes. In 2007, he was arrested for the murder of 18-year-old Colleen McMillan near Prince George. Investigators found indications he might be tied to other disappearances. Fogan hauled timber, knew the back roads, and his routes overlapped with several missing person sites. Trucks conferred advantages to a serial offender. Mobility across vast territory with rapid exit from crime scenes. Perceived safety. Many hitchhikers prefer rides from professional drivers. Concealment. The cab and trailer can hide bodies and evidence. Terrain knowledge. Professional drivers know remote cuts where an assault can go unseen. The Fogan inquiry exposed a darker side of truck stop culture along Highway 16. Some drivers treated young hitchhikers as easy prey. Stories circulated in diners and on lots, women picked up along the road, often told with a sexual undertone. An informal network traded word on available women in different towns. In that culture, violence against women could be normalized, even encouraged. In 2012, U.S. authorities arrested Bobby Jack Fowler, an Oregon truck driver, for murdering 3 women. Records showed he regularly crossed into Canada and may have been involved in disappearances linked to Highway 16. Stacy Stites vanished in June 2006 near Vanderhoof. Border logs placed Fowler crossing into Canada that day. Jody Hendrickson disappeared in August 2005, traveling from Prince George to Terrace. Witnesses saw her speaking with the driver of an American rig. Fowler's case underscored the cross-border nature of the threat. Offenders could operate on both sides of the line, exploiting differences in law and gaps in coordination. Information on suspicious travelers did not always move quickly or cleanly between agencies. Over the years, police considered many other suspects. Edward Dennis Ike was arrested in 2008 for a homicide in Prince George, with some evidence hinting at links to highway-related disappearances. Randall Hopley abducted and killed boys near Sparwood in 2011. Investigators reviewed any ties to other regional crimes. Multiple unidentified drivers appeared in witness accounts as men who picked up women along the highway and behaved suspiciously. The lesson was brutally simple. Where isolation, poverty, and thin policing meet, predators will travel. and so will their victims' last rides. One of the greatest challenges was that many potential victims vanished without a trace. Without bodies, it was hard to prove homicide rather than a voluntary disappearance. Serial predators often concealed remains deep in remote forests, places where they could lie undiscovered for years or even decades. Some offenders burned bodies or used other disposal methods that left little forensic evidence. Criminal psychologists assembled a composite profile for offenders operating along Highway 16, a man between 25 and 50, access to a car or truck, strong knowledge of the region through work, driver, logger, construction, bias against Indigenous women, viewing them as less visible victims, insight into police practices and confidence in impunity, possible alcohol or drug issues, a history of domestic violence. Despite several arrests over the years, most disappearances along Highway 16 remain unsolved. Investigators believe multiple independent offenders have operated in the region, not a single serial killer. Some disappearances may be accidental or unrelated to crime, but the overall pattern shows the highway attracted predators who targeted vulnerable women. The exposure of cases tied to Robert Pickton, Corey Fogan, and others forced a rethink. It became clear this was not one man or one place. A coordinated response was needed across police services and across borders. Specialized serial crime units were created, information sharing improved, and new investigative methods adopted. Prevention became a priority. More patrols on Highway 16, especially in evening and night hours. Cameras at gas stations and other hitchhiking hotspots. Alternative transport programs for at-risk communities. Public education efforts on hitchhiking risks and danger signals. Training for officers in serial crime investigation and in working with vulnerable communities. The serial predator era along Highway 16 left a deep mark on northern Indigenous communities. A generation of young Indigenous women grew up fearing that road. Many refused to hitchhike, limiting paths to school and work. Families live with grief and uncertainty. Many still do not know what happened to their loved ones. Yet the solved cases also brought a measure of hope. They proved that justice is possible, that offenders can be found and punished. These cases became a catalyst for serious reform in law enforcement and for a shift in how society understands violence against Indigenous women. Highway 16 remains a dangerous corridor, but today it is a danger that is acknowledged, studied, and fought. Thank you for watching. Share a theory or perspective in the comments and say what you think it will take to make this road truly safe.